All right, so I hope that those of you at home can hear and see, and those of you in the audience can see. Okay, so if you notice somebody's trying to get admitted, give me the signal or something and we'll let them in. So my name's Jane Garver. I'm the director here at the museum, and it's great to have you here this evening. And those of you at home joining us, thank you. I don't want to forget to promote our event tomorrow. You probably saw the big tent out there. So cornrows tickets are available. You can get them at the door tomorrow. We have takeout containers available in case you don't like the weather so much, but we're hoping it'll get itself all through beforehand. If you're not a member, I know several of you are, but if you're not a member, I do have membership envelopes here as well. And I hope you had a chance to look around the museum, but if you didn't, there will be an opportunity after the program. So, celebration of our 50th anniversary as a museum, we opened in August of 1974. I decided to revisit the programs that they did in 1974. And first, I just was curious, you know, what kind of things were they talking about at the Historical Society then? And then I decided these were some pretty interesting programs, and we haven't done the topics that they did, so why not revisit them? So this one was presented in August 74, and they actually brought in a guest speaker. He was someone from the Clark Library at CMU. And they have quite an extensive collection of Strang artifacts and books and things at the Clark. So he used his materials. I didn't have those materials here, so I used some other things. So James Jesse Strang was born on March 21st, 1813. So thinking about your timeline, this is quite a while ago. We got somebody else coming in. Perfect. Thank you. He was born in Scipio. It's Scipio, New York. His parents were Clement and Abigail Strang, and here they are on the screen. Some of the sources say that his name was originally Jesse James, and Jesse James the Outlaw was around in this time frame. And so some sources said his name was originally Jesse James Strang, and he changed it because of newspaper reports of the outlaw Jesse James, and he became James Jesse Strang. Other sources don't say that, so it's unclear. And there's a lot of that where different sources say different things when we're talking about so long ago. Oh, and this never wants to click. There we go. So here he is, James Jesse Strang. Also, because this is so long ago, there's not a lot of pictures. This is the picture of him that I could find. There might be a few others floating around out there. Living in New York, he attended school until he was 12 years old. He was admitted to the bar in New York at age 23, having his up to age 12 education. And he practiced law periodically throughout his life. He was also a farmer, a schoolmaster, a postmaster, which is important later, a member of the militia, a temperance lecturer, a newspaper editor, also comes up again later, and a Baptist minister. So he was baptized Baptist when he was 12 years old. Many sources say he was a powerful speaker, and some sources say he was a very small person, like physically small. You might wonder, why is Princess Victoria here? How is she connected? So James Strang kept a diary when he was growing up, and some of it was written in a code, which was not translated until 100 years after his death by his grandson, Mark, who found or had the code, or somehow he was able to translate these diaries, but not for 100 years. So then scholars were able to study the journals and diaries more carefully. James mentions in his journal when he was a young man that he would like to marry Princess Victoria or become a member of royalty somehow. What he said was, my mind has always been filled with dreams of royalty and power. So that comes up later as well. So it's all kind of setting the stage. He did not marry Princess Victoria. Erie Canal. So when he was 23, the same year he was admitted to the bar in New York, he got married to his first wife, Mary Pierce, or Pierce, P-E-R-C-E, in most of the sources. There's an I to make it a Pierce in some of the sources. His father-in-law, Mr. Pierce, was the superintendent of repairs for the Erie Canal. But he was a corrupt superintendent who was embezzling from the Erie Canal offices to the tune of about $1 million. And so he was in prison, the father-in-law, but he didn't spend much time there. And when he was released, he moved to Michigan and Wisconsin and Illinois and Indiana, and he was working on other canals because he was an experienced canal man, even though he was also an embezzler. So Mary's father, Mr. Pierce, encouraged James and Mary to follow him out west for a job on the canal. Unfortunately, by the time they got there, no job was available because Mr. Pierce had been found out again. So no job was available. So instead, James and Mary went to live with her brother in the same town. I don't think it was in the same house, in Burlington, Wisconsin. Her brother was there. He had moved there from New York, and he had a store and a house. And so James and Mary went there. Unfortunately, their eldest daughter, also named Mary, died there in 1843. She was only 5 years old. And some people say that that death was one reason that James Strang was drawn to Joseph Smith, who was at that time trying to recruit members. And he wasn't necessarily a powerful speaker, but he spoke a lot and did tent revivals and did different things. And so a lot of the sources said that it was this terrible tragedy in his family that may have led him to visit with Joseph Smith and get involved. Oh, I thought I saw another, you didn't see another blue pop up, did you? Okay. Thought I saw something. So they're living in Wisconsin. So that's, see if I So they're living up here in Wisconsin, and James is a lawyer. So he traveled south for something to do with a client or something for his law practice. A friend from Wisconsin said, you really need to hear this guy talk. His name's Joseph Smith, and you really need to hear him talk. You should stop there. Well, the stop was about 175 miles out of his way, but he did it. So he was Houston, he went here to Nauvoo to hear Joseph Smith speak. When he went to Nauvoo, it was at that time a metropolis, and it's really hard to find pictures of that time period. So this is a little bit later, but the sources say that Nauvoo, Illinois at that time was the second largest city in Illinois. So it rivaled Chicago as being a metropolis. So that's where Joseph Smith was and had been building up this town It had been named Commerce, and it was an abandoned town, or practically abandoned, when Joseph Smith and his followers came there from Missouri. So they'd essentially been kicked out of Missouri, run out of town, and they went to Commerce, Illinois, an abandoned town, and kind of started over. They named it Nauvoo, which is Hebrew for beautiful place, and started building that up. And that's where James Strang and Joseph Smith met. Here's Joseph Smith. In February of 1844, James was baptized in the Mormon faith by Joseph Smith, and then he was maybe something else by Joseph Smith's older brother, who was also a part of the group. It was just a few weeks later that Joseph Smith sent James Strang to Voorhee, Wisconsin, to start a new settlement. So he'd only been with Joseph Smith for a very short time, a few weeks. He's baptized into the faith. He's made an elder or some other member of the faith and sent off to Voorhee, Wisconsin, which is near where he already lived, to set up a new settlement. While he is traveling to Voorhee, Joseph Smith was murdered. He had been so Joseph Smith had some bad press. The newspapers were printing things about him that he disagreed with. And so he broke up literally physically broke the printing press, and was taken to jail. And it was while he was in jail that he was killed. So James Strang, newly in the Mormon faith, has just left Joseph Smith, and Joseph Smith has been killed. So, because of that, can you hear me okay? I can hear you a little bit. You might want to mute if you're on Zoom. Joseph Smith became the Mormon leader because he said that Angel Moroni led him to the golden plates with writings that he translated into the Book of Mormon. James Strang said that an angel led him to brass plates that he translated to say he should be the new leader. So it is a very similar story to the story that Joseph Smith told. James Strang had 4 witnesses that swore that he told them an angel had come to him and that he needed to go to this specific tree and dig up the brass plates. And these 4 witnesses signed a testimony that said they went to the tree with him. They were told to look all around the tree to make sure nothing had been dug up, that the soil hadn't ever been moved. They had a big description about the roots of the tree had not been moved, and it was an old tree. And then they dug 3 feet down and they found these plates, and he translated them, and they said that he should be the leader. So this was sworn by his witnesses. His other proof was that he had a letter that Joseph Smith had written to him to say that he wanted him to be the next leader. The problem with the letter is that it wasn't authenticated, but what scholars did authenticate was the postmark. So remember that James Strang had been a postmaster, and of course postmarks in 1844 are very different from today. So today everything's automated and the post office does the stamp and they all look alike and whatever, but in 1844. It's not like that. Not even every letter gets a stamp or a postmark. But this one is authenticated to have been sent from Nauvoo, and it's the right time period and all of that. But what people think is that he really did send a letter, but it wasn't this letter. And so the postmark is authenticated, or James Strang knew how to forge a postmark because he worked at the post office. And then the letter has not been authenticated to say that it really was from Joseph Smith saying that he should be the leader. But this is James Strang's proof. So he's got these witnesses that say, come with, he went to this tree and we went with him and it had never been disturbed, and he dug up these brass plates and then he translated them for us and they told us he was the leader. And also he has this letter that Joseph Smith said he definitely should take his place as the leader. And this letter was received the minute Joseph Smith died was when the angel came to him and when he received the letter and all of these things. So obviously he should be the leader, is what he said. So Brigham Young also said that he should be the leader. And so Brigham Young took a large group of people from Nauvoo and they went to Salt Lake City. James Strang had a much smaller group that wanted to follow him, and he took them first to Voree, but that wasn't working out so well. And so they moved on to Beaver Island, which is what we'll be focusing on. So Brigham Young eventually had about 50,000 followers. And at its height, James Strang had about 12,000 followers, which is a really huge following. When you think about Beaver Island and how big that is, they weren't all living on Beaver Island. His followers were around, and also some of them stayed in Wisconsin, and he traveled around the country recruiting people. So he actually did a lot of traveling. And when I think about in 1845, trying to travel around the United States, so he's traveling by stagecoach, steamship. There's no train yet. So it was not easy travel that he was doing, but he was traveling all around. He took several trips on the Great Lakes, and from Wisconsin to Mackinac, or Wisconsin and around the Great Lakes all the way to Detroit, he's seeing Beaver Island and going past Beaver Island. And he decided that that would be the perfect place to move his settlement. So they weren't really well liked in Voree. He was having trouble with people who were not Mormon. And so he decided Beaver Island, because it was isolated, would be a better fit for them, and that they wouldn't be bothered by other people. So he was on a steamer in Lake Michigan. He saw Beaver Island. He tried to start convincing people that they should move to Beaver Island. It took a lot of convincing to get people to actually go, because it's so isolated. But what he told them was that an apocalypse was coming, and he had all these signs. There was the Mexican-American War. There were a lot of revolutions in Europe. A lot of monarchs were being overthrown. The Irish potato famine, the unrest between the northern and southern states. And so all of this was his evidence that they really needed to move to this isolated place and they would be safe there because the apocalypse was coming. And so by 1849, he got several people to move. They had about 600 people that he got to move to Beaver Island, but he didn't stay there very long himself because he was traveling around trying to recruit more people. So he's doing all kinds of travel. There were people who already lived on Beaver Island, and they weren't super happy to be invaded like that. Because one of the plans that James Strang had was that he was going to cut down the trees to sell them to the steamers, because they used the lumber to run the steamships. And so they would stop at Beaver Island at that port and buy lumber. And so his big plan was that he was going to cut down all the trees and sell them to steamships and make a lot of money. He also announced his plan to make Beaver Island as profitable or more profitable than Mackinac Island. So he seems to always have this rivalry with Mackinac Island. And he saw them as really profitable, which they were because of the fur trade, very early, Mackinac. And so he wanted to do even better than Mackinac, and also to kind of run them out of business. And Beaver Island was going to be the place. So he started making a lot of changes. He tried to destroy the whiskey trade. He renamed places on the island. So St. James is named for him. He used a lot of biblical names around the island. The lake that they used for baptisms is Font Lake, like the baptismal font. The river became the River Jordan, things like that. We had a revelation in 1849 that he should become a polygamist, but he didn't tell anybody about it, because it was that was controversial for Joseph Smith and for other Mormons. And so he didn't tell anybody that he had this revelation, but he had it. And he sent his second in command to talk to this girl who had moved recently to Beaver Island with her family, and to see if she might be interested in marrying him. And she agreed. So he secretly married her. Her name was Elvira. He secretly married her. Then he left her on Beaver Island, and he took his wife and his 3 kids to his parents' house in New York and left them there. Then he had his new wife meet him in New York, and he started this tour of trying to recruit more people all around the East Coast. He went to conventions and revivals, and he was recruiting people. And his new wife was with him, but she was Charles Douglas, his nephew. And so that's how they introduced her to people. They said that this was his secretary or his assistant, Charles Douglas, because he didn't want to tell people yet that he had this revelation about polygamy. So instead, he traveled with his new wife as if she were this man, Charles Douglas. So you have to remember that women's fashions at that time were such that a woman never would wear pants and a shirt. A woman would wear a dress that was this big, and corsets and petticoats and all those kind of things. And so it would be much easier for a woman to disguise herself as a man than it would be today, because today women wear the same thing. You know, women wear jeans and t-shirts just like men do. But back then, women never did that, except for the about 500 women that pretended to be men so they could be soldiers in the Civil War a little bit later. So Elvira was trained as a tailor. And so that is probably one way that she was able to make her own clothes and make nice clothes so that she could disguise herself as a man. And they traveled all around the East. Some people were suspicious about this nephew that suddenly appeared, but they were able to do this for several months, traveling around as uncle and nephew, recruiting new members. They went to Washington, D.C. Because James Strang wanted to petition the government to give him Beaver Island. He thought that they should just give it to him so that they could all live there and they wouldn't bother anybody, and nobody wanted it anyway, he said, even though there were other people living there who did want to live there, and there were some Odawa living there that did want to live there. So he petitioned the government, but it didn't happen. They didn't give it to him. But he and his followers essentially were living there without ever having purchased much of the land at all. And they definitely were cutting down trees without any permission to do that. So some of his followers really started to suspect something with Charlie, and they accused him of adultery because he hadn't yet revealed his revelation that he should be a polygamist. When they did that, he suspended them from the church for slander, or he had them whipped. So the people who were speaking out against him started to just leave Beaver Island. And so then he didn't have people speaking out against him anymore. He returned to Beaver Island with his first wife, Mary, and their kids. And Charlie, Elvira, came later. And then he announced that God had commanded him to be crowned king on July 8th, which was Elvira's birthday, coincidentally, or not. He wore a red robe, and he had the president of the Council of Elders place a metal crown on his head. They had a banquet at Font Lake, where he announced his revelation about polygamy. So he said, I was told I should be a king. They crowned him king. And then he said, also, we should have plural marriage. And they said, okay. And then he presented his second wife, Elvira. Mary and their 3 children did leave and go to Wisconsin, but not until 1851. So they stuck around for a while. His second in command, who was Mr. Adams, I believe, was also a theatrical person who liked to put on plays. And so he was a big part of the coronation of the king because he had costumes and he had backdrops and he put on plays. Later on, though, he gets a little bit put out with James Strang and he leaves to go put on plays in Detroit. Remember that he had been a newspaper editor. Well, he started a newspaper called the Northern Islander. It is available on newspapers.com, so you can read it all for yourself if you're interested. It's pretty interesting, but remember, this is 1845. And so there's no pictures really. There's maybe a couple sketches here and there, but it's very long broadsheet columns of newspaper articles. And they were very, very long because this was the entertainment. You know, there's no internet, no radio, no television, plays. We're going lots of plays and those kind of things. But the newspaper articles are very long, but you can read them. The parts that I found interesting was that they listed the ships that had come by. So that was like the ship watch was one little column in the newspaper, and they would tell all the ships that came by that month or however frequently they were printing. Also, they have a little disclaimer that if you are a subscriber to the newspaper, but you don't live on Beaver Island, that there will be a gap from December till about April because they can't get the paper to you because of the frozen lake. So just be warned if you get a subscription, they said. This is a sketch of his home on Beaver Island, where it was from 1850 to 1856. So really quite a short time that he was on Beaver Island, just 6 years. He did have some conflict with the non-Mormons on Beaver Island. He shot a cannon at them called the War of Whiskey Point in 1850. Millard Fillmore, the president. So Millard Fillmore was a Whig. That was his political party. He became president because Zachary Taylor died in office. He got sick. He wasn't assassinated. So Zachary Taylor went to the 4th of July commemoration or something at the Washington Monument. They were dedicating the Washington Monument, and Zachary Taylor went to it. It was a really hot day. Somehow he got very sick and he died. So Millard Fillmore became the president. But Zachary Taylor had never involved Millard Fillmore in much of anything. So Millard Fillmore really didn't know what he was doing. And he was worried about losing power and losing control. The Mormons tended to vote Democrat. And so he was worried that a lot of Mormons would vote against him. So one of the things that Millard Fillmore did was to push through Utah statehood and make Brigham Young the governor so that he could get the Mormon vote. So that was one thing. But the Michigan governor and attorney general said that they were worried about this James Strang on Beaver Island. And they got in touch with the United States Attorney General, who got in touch with Millard Fillmore, and they convinced him to arrest James Strang for, among other things, interfering with the mail. He was apparently stealing mail off the steamers as they came by, counterfeiting stamps and coins, stealing lumber, which was really the big thing, because lumber was kind of like the gold rush. They were going to make even more money than they made in the gold rush on lumber. And so if he's stealing all of it and cutting it down without permission and not paying taxes and all the things, and he doesn't own the property. So that's really what they were going to get him on. But also piracy on Lake Michigan. So Millard Fillmore agrees that they're going to send a boat to go get him, but it's a whole long thing where the president comes to Detroit, and he and the attorney general and the governor of Michigan and the all these other people get on the steamship, and they're riding around on the Great Lakes making this plan for how they're going to capture him. And they go to Mackinac Island. And at that point, I don't think Millard Fillmore is on the boat. I'm just picturing the president still on the boat. I don't think he was, but maybe he was. They go to Mackinac Island. They kidnap a judge who is friendly with James Strang, and they tell him that they're going to hang him if he doesn't write a letter to James Strang and tell him he needs to turn himself over to the authorities. And so then they go to Beaver Island with this judge on the boat, and they are trying to convince somebody there to go and get James Strang. They can't find him. They say he's on the island, but who knows? And this is 1850, this is 1850. So he could be anywhere. It's really hard to find him, but they're searching Beaver Island. They finally do get him to get on the boat with them. And really, he could have just taken off, but he didn't. And so they arrested James Strang, and about 30 other people turned themselves in, and they take them all on a boat. And these are some of the forgery charges against him. And they take them all from Beaver Island to Detroit with these charges. So most of the people were set free. And I think that it was after they got them all to Detroit. So then they've got to get themselves back home. But James Strang and several others had to stand trial in Detroit. So here's Detroit around that time. It looks a little different than it does today. I had a hard time finding images. I was looking for the courthouse in Detroit, and that was the old courthouse was built in 1870. So that was after, that wasn't the courthouse that James Strang went to. They stood trial from May to July of 1851. Some of the sources say he was his own lawyer because he was a brilliant lawyer. Some of the sources say he hired a brilliant lawyer. Whichever the case, he eventually was acquitted and let go. While he was in Detroit in jail and standing trial, there were some events going on Beaver Island. Somebody was murdered. One of the non-Mormons was murdered. The Mormons said that he was trying to escape arrest and that they really didn't kill him. It was because he was fleeing custody. So there all kinds of unrest was going on Beaver Island while James Strang is in Detroit with these few guys on trial. He goes back to Beaver Island and he starts to really crack down. So he was able to control the Mormons just by being the head of the church and being the king of the church. The non-Mormons, the Gentiles, he controlled because he was also the township supervisor, the justice of the peace, and the chairman of the board of health. So he was able to make a lot of rules because he had all these positions and he basically controlled everything. For example, he made rules that everyone, whether they were Mormon or Gentile, who lived on the island must tithe 10% of their cattle, their harvest, their lumber, their time, and any other wealth that they had. Punishment for failing to tithe was flogging. He also made rules forbidding coffee, tea, alcohol, and gambling. So this is a notice in the paper about there's no liquor on Beaver Island, and anyone who comes there needs to be aware that no alcohol is allowed. So in January of 1852, he married his third wife, Betsy McNutt. On November 1st of 1852, he announced that any Gentiles left on Beaver Island had to report to the harbor and be baptized, or they had to leave the island. And the sources say that they all left. Many people went to Drummond Island who had been on Beaver Island. So now all of the people on the island are part of the Mormon faith. The ones who disagreed with him early on in things like polygamy, he whipped them or punished them in other ways, and they left. They went to Charlevoix, which was Pine River then, or they went back to Warrior, Wisconsin. The non-Mormon people now have left because he said you can't be here unless you're baptized, and so they all left. So he's got this following, all these people who are faithful to him. And so he was elected as a state of Michigan representative, and he went to Lansing. While he was in Lansing, he got a bill passed to form Emmett County. And Emmett County was current Emmett County and Charlevoix County and Beaver Island, and St. James was the seat, the county seat. So he was really trying to wrest control away from Mackinac Island. So he had this whole thing with Mackinac Island. So he wanted all the control to be not Mackinac Island, and he was going to have control over all of this. So he's got all of this that he's the representative of, and St. James is the county seat. So really a lot of control. He was a member of the Michigan House of Representatives from 1853 to 1856. And if you go on the Michigan House of Representatives website and look at all of their members throughout history, he's there, and he's there with his bill to create Emmett County. So some of the people that had disagreed with him early on, like I said, they went to Charlevoix, which was called Pine River at the time. And now that was part of Emmett County. So really what you can see on the map was Emmett County. You have all of that plus Beaver Island with the county seat. So his former followers were living in Pine River, and he sent some men from Beaver Island in their fishing boats, which I cannot imagine going all the way from St. James down to Charlevoix in your fishing boat, but they did. Because he said that some of these followers who had left that he was sort of put out with had jury duty and they had to come to St. James. And these guys from the island had gone in their fishing boats to get them, to take them to do their jury duty. Well, they didn't want to go. And so they had what is now known as the Battle of Pine River, where they had a shootout, which I teach in Charlevoix, and my kids love to know that there was a shootout at Pine River. So that was definitely a problem for the Beaver Island men, who really, there weren't many of them, and there were many more people in Pine River. And so the Beaver Islanders left. There were about 2,600 people that lived on Beaver Island, but it was only a few men that had come to Pine River. Today, only about 600 people live on the island year round. So it was a much larger population then. There were about 1,700 living in Charlevoix then. There's about 3,000 now.
Were there any casualties in this battle?
There were not any deaths. I think that some people did get wounded in the Battle of Pine River. In 1855, James Strang married the cousins Sarah and Phoebe Wright, who were 17 and 18 years old at the time. He was married 5 times in total, to Mary, Elvira, or Charlie, Betsy, Sarah, and Phoebe. And together they had 14 children. Sarah and Phoebe's children were born, spoiler alert, after James Strang died. Notice that Elvira's son, her first oldest son, is Charles. So that was the name that she had taken when she was acting as his nephew. And then she named her son Charles. Or maybe he did. 2 of the boys are named James. And what else did I notice? Oh, Clement and Abigail were his parents' names.
Was he married to all of them at the same time?
Yes.
So at one point he had 5 wives?
Yes. But Mary, remember, separated from him and went back to Voorhees, Wisconsin in 1851. So she wasn't very happy about the plural marriage arrangement, and she left with her 3 surviving children, Myraette, William, and Harriet. Women's fashion is actually his downfall, which I think is fascinating. So the colored picture is how women were dressing in 1856, 1855, 1856. So the layers and layers of petticoats and the corsets and all of those kind of things. James Strang, which some people say he was so progressive, said that women should wear pantaloons and short dresses that just came to their knees. So the black and white picture. And that was what he thought women should dress like. And so he, because it would be easier to do work if you had pants and a shorter dress, which I guess I agree. It would be a lot easier than wearing a corset and several layers of petticoats. So he decreed that all the women on Beaver Island had to dress this way, with pantaloons and a short skirt. Most of the women complied. They just did what he said they should do. He was the king and the leader and the health officer and all the rest. But there were a few women that didn't want to do it. They felt like it was immodest. Women don't wear pants. The skirt is way too short. It really is not how women should dress, and they refused to do it. Their husbands, Mr. Wentworth and Mr. Bedford, were punished because the wives wouldn't do what they were told. So James Strang had Bedford and Wentworth whipped because their wives wouldn't comply and wear the pantaloons. Those 2 men sought revenge, and on June 16th, 1856, they ambushed and shot their king. The USS Michigan the very same boat that Millard Fillmore rowed around the Great Lakes, and the same boat that had taken James Strang to Detroit to stand trial happened to be in the harbor at St. James on this night when he was shot. Was it a coincidence that it was there? We don't know, but the boat was there. So James Strang was hit 3 times. A bullet grazed his head, a bullet lodged in his cheek, and he was shot from behind, and a bullet lodged in his spine, and he was paralyzed. Mr. Wentworth, Mr. Bedford, and their families got on board the USS Michigan and begged for asylum. They were granted asylum. The ship's captain ship's captains were powerful. He could have arrested them. Instead, he took them to Mackinac Island, where they were congratulated because there'd been this problem with Mackinac Island, this conflict all this time. And so they were taken to Mackinac Island. They were congratulated on having shot King Strang, James Strang. James Strang was taken from Beaver Island. He was still alive. He was paralyzed. He was taken to Voorhees, Wisconsin, where he did pass away. The Mackinac Island fishermen and others went from Mackinac Island to Beaver Island, and they forced all the rest of the Mormons to leave the island. They got on various passing ships and were let off in Milwaukee, Chicago, Voorhees, all different places on the other side of Lake Michigan, Green Bay. James Strang was buried in Wisconsin, and he passed away July 9th, 1856. So I don't know that I can answer any questions about that strange tale, but I'd be happy to try if anybody has any questions. Yes.
There's a book called The Child of the Sea. That
Mhm,
talks about this from a non-Mormon's point of view, a young girl.
Yes.
And she's talked about how he would take over their homes as well.
Mhm.
So that home that you're showing us could very well
Could have
be
been somebody else's. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, he really took over everything. Yeah.
Did all his wife, I mean, did any of his wives stay together, or did they all disperse, you know?
I
after
don't
that?
know. I just know that the 2 youngest were pregnant when he died, and so their children were born after his death.
Okay.
And some of his children lived very long lives into their 80s and 90s. So they were around for quite a while.
Did the wives remarried?
Nope. One of the wives had been married before and interestingly left her husband because he took a second wife, and then she became a third wife. It was his third wife. So that was interesting too. Yeah.
Do you know, I don't, when polygamy became officially illegal in the United States?
I don't know. Mm-mm.
Because I know that at one point, now I'm going from one end of it, the United States sent 1/3 of the United States Army. And I don't think in these years it was a big army. This was between War of 1812 and Mexican War, and so it was, it was a huge group, but I sent 1/3 of them to Utah to put an end to polygamy. So at that point, by the 1850s, it must have been illegal everywhere in the United States.
I would think so. Yeah. But I don't know. That would be something I'd have to look up. Yeah. Any other questions? I'm gonna stop the recording if I can find it.